Oh, yay.
There we go. There we go. Hi, Kate.
Todd Caldecott in the house.
I'm so sorry about yesterday. It just was.
Don't be. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter at all.
Cool.
I'm psyched.
Good.
So we're going to jump right in.
All right, let's do it.
Psychedelics, Ayurveda. I'm doing research for my book, Wild Habits. And one of the wild habits I've come on is tripping, along with other somewhat surprising habits like urine therapy.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
That's
so my community is like neck deep into urine therapy at this point. And having tremendous results. So in any case, I wrote this book called Upcycling Your Pee. It's a graphic novel. It's not released yet. And I decided I needed to write another book that had context.
Okay.
Right. And that's what Wild Habits is. It's like all the things that my community is doing in Body Thrive, which evolved out of Dinacharya, right? The basic daily habits in Ayurveda and yoga. And, part of the habits that sort of surprised me along the way of like what we're doing and what's working and doing the research is tripping. And so you've been doing a lot of research on Ayurveda and psychedelics. I just ran across a study that was on like what's going on with psychedelics having an effect on autoimmune disease. There's other research on psychedelics and depression. So you've been using it in your clinical practice.
Yeah.
And what are you using it for?
Well, I've been using psychedelics in my practice for about 20 years. And mostly it's to facilitate this sort of ego dissolution process. Like a lot of our problems can be rooted in just having very hard boundary of our ego, and we lose the flexibility and flow in our life. We identify too much with the external and not so much with the internal flowing process. So I would say generally stepping back from the specifics, that's probably what I use it for most.
Yeah.
And that can translate to things like autoimmune issues or depression or anxiety or PTSD.
Do you find really it goes like any of the symptoms of chronic systemic inflammation could, and I know that's a huge category, but like how that could benefit from an ego shift if we're looking at how negative stressors and the allostatic state, like the opposite of what in Ayurveda we call svastha, or like being seated in ourself, being seated in homeostasis, like any of those, the person could have a wake-up call of just like, oh wait, my habits are killing me slowly.
Yeah, well, the concept of ahankara in Ayurveda resonates with the concept of immunity, of the recognition of self versus not self. I mean, our bodies are synthesized, manufactured from the very building blocks of life that we find lie external to us. The only thing that separates us between what's external and internal physically is the selectively permeable membrane. And that's another word for saying a healthy ego boundary, so that I can allow certain things to come in and block other things, negative things from coming in. And so maintain this equilibrium between what exists without, what exists within. So autoimmune disease is a loss of that selective permeability. It begins physically within the gut, but it has also effects on a higher level in terms of our ego boundaries. And often we'll engage in certain practices, negative dietary practices, for example, because of ego issues, like a need to feel loved, for example, and how to create healthy boundaries around love. So we end up eating ice cream compulsively, instead of getting that particular need met. So I think that having a healthy gut membrane, a healthy, like to address issues like leaky gut, so have a healthy gut lining, has its corollary in having a healthy ego boundary. So that's the connection there. And so if you have a difficult time with boundaries generally, then it can manifest anywhere along that spectrum from, psychosocial, emotional, all the way down to a more physical expression. That's understandable from the context of Ayurveda. When I say, oh, the person suffering from excess dryness, it can relate to a physical dryness, but also more subtle emotional, psychological dryness. And in Ayurveda, we'll use any number of therapies to, both subtle as well as obvious, to address that imbalance. So I think there definitely is a connection between all those factors.
Yeah, and even how in chronic inflammation, like whether it goes to autoimmune or cancer or heart disease or kidney disease or, just immune, before it goes to autoimmune, there's a sense that those boundaries have changed.
Mm-hmm.
Those boundaries within what's going on in the cells. So we have entirely different chemical reactions happening in a fit, relaxed, easeful person who's orienting towards stress in terms of choosing to orient towards stress positively,
Mm-hmm.
as positive stressors rather than life's on top of me. Because like when you were talking a second ago, I was like, how many people are just like the boundary issue is work, or the boundary issue is busyness, or the boundary issue is being chronically overscheduled and not able to be in the flow of the moment, present for parenting, present for time for self, present for body.
Yeah, and there are spillover effects that happen from our interaction with nature as a species to our individuated experience, because we're all cells in a superorganism called humanity. So this is how you can explain problems like cancer. It's not just related to your individual factors. There are broader, more systemic factors that relate to how humans relate to the natural world and how that's out of balance, and how, essentially from an innocent place, we end up with chronic diseases, nothing to do specifically with a really bad diet or a poor proper approach to health, but we are suffering the effects of humans not living in right relationship with the planet. And so that's
which goes back to ego and boundaries and boundary dissolution. And
but as a superorganism, as a species, like our boundaries with Earth are problematic, to say the least.
To say the least. Yeah. I mean, it's really interesting, right? Like how symbiotic a relationship we have on our own, whether it's in our own apartment or our own property, right? Like, are we composting? Like, it's just, it can be as simple as that, right? Of just, are we allowing our energy to connect with the earth by walking on the ground rather than on a treadmill? I mean, there's just so many ways of just even perceiving connection to environment. But let's talk about how that is. It's like induced by tripping, because there's that connection as the ego dissolves into the natural environment where we're much more connected. Often that's a effect of people tripping, is they're much more part of the five elements. They're much more part of nature. They have insights, they might have insights in terms of seeing patterns and pattern recognition. Tell me what you've seen in clinical practice with that.
Yeah, well, I mean, here you're talking about macrodosing. So this is to facilitate that ego dissolution state. So once those boundaries of individuation dissolve and we kind of merge with the boundless, then of course we find that we have all these interconnections with the natural world. And we begin to see patterns that weren't evident, that are there regardless of whether or not we see them in our individuated reality. But when that dissolves, then we begin to see patterns that we weren't able to see before, because we're so locked into this very individualistic perspective. So it's a very healthy experience to have, this sort of ego transcendent state. And, it's something I think that is affirmed by practices like yoga. The problem is that we're so imbalanced in our Western culture that simply just sitting and meditating for a lot of people just doesn't get them there, especially because people kind of pursue enlightenment with such dogged determination. It becomes another ego-driven pursuit instead of just allowing it to be a natural unfolding. So I think that they're very helpful from that perspective to promote the state of ego dissolution as a reset, essentially. So I use both. I use like macrodosing in my practice, and then I've been using microdosing in my practice, specifically magic mushrooms, for the last decade or so. And that's also very helpful, particularly for like severe chronic depression.
And do you find there's constitutional differences with dosage?
Well, like with macro and micro,
Yeah.
I guess depends on the substance that we're talking about. People have different like thresholds in terms of the psychedelic hallucinogenic effects. Some people are more sensitive, some people are less sensitive, some people require less or more. I think it probably falls along the lines of sort of classic constitutional differences. People that are more vata are more sensitive, typically require a smaller dose. Need a lot more preparation in terms of lead up to the experience, and a lot more follow-up in terms of helping them to ground out that experience. But like I probably, when I'm doing, like, say, I work a lot with magic mushrooms. I've also worked with MDMA and LSD for different purposes, other substances like 2CB as well. But let's say something like psilocybin, I use the psilocybe cubensis, simply because I can rely upon it as a sort of like the potency and strength are pretty much similar from batch to batch. That I start with a macrodose, pretty much everyone like it at about 5 grams, which is a pretty strong dosage. But I'm trying to elicit that state of ego dissolution. The worst thing is to have someone take something and then, be on the launching pad and not actually off. And sometimes people don't, you can give them 5-10 grams and they don't have any experience. And that's
and it's different on different days too, right? I mean,
could be. Yeah, different cyclical flows, different times of the month, the lunar cycle, the seasons. I don't have enough experience correlating those different things. I mean, most people do respond to a 5-gram dosage, but over the years, there's been a few people that haven't. And usually those are people that are taking other medications. And even though we've done a bit of a washout, say 3 days where they haven't taken any of their medication, still those receptors are still overstimulated and they don't respond. But sometimes it's just a psychological thing. Like they just don't allow themselves to go there. They don't allow that dissolution state. There's too much pain, there's too much trauma for that breakthrough to happen.
Yeah. And so how are you guiding them in the macro?
Like there's lots of different ways to do it. I don't want to get so wrapped up in their process. I'm basically just holding space and making sure that they're safe. And
so it's a guided experience you do with your client, with certain clients.
A guided experience. Like I'm not trying to impose my values, my ideas, my concepts onto them. I'm more creating a safe container for them to have whatever experience they need to have.
Yeah.
I'll answer their questions. I'll provide support.
But you're there. That's all I meant.
A can of water, you know what I mean? Yeah. Like I give them a blanket, if they need a cuddle. I will do all those things, but I don't have a process. Say like other practices, like using ayahuasca, like there's a traditional practice, which I'm not sure in many cases is all that traditional at all. But I find that sometimes that can come from a very like an ego state, like, oh, I'm going to take you through this psychedelic experience and this whole process and this ritual and everything. I'm not so much into that because I want this unfolding process to be natural, and I don't want them to go away with any of my narrative.
Right. So it's more like sitting.
It is
like sitting with than guiding.
Exactly. Yeah. Creating a space.
And the preparatory process for when you do the macro, do you have them change their diet or start to focus on intention or kind of clean up their circadian rhythm before, or how does that work?
Well, sometimes it's not really.
I mean, they're
possible.
already working with you, right?
Yeah.
No, tell me.
Sometimes that's not possible. I mean, people have so many mixed up factors in their life that it's not possible just to resolve everything. That's why they're going through the experience in the first place. So it's
right. That's why they need the trip.
Exactly. Yeah. So if they're able to do that, then they probably wouldn't need it in the first place. So I usually just
they do it for different reasons, right? They'd use it for different reasons.
Yeah. So,
more of like the spirit, because I mean, if we talk about there's like a spiritual trajectory. Once someone doesn't have chronic inflammation, they don't have the diseases of chronic inflammation, they get to a point often where they want to develop their potential, and that's a whole other reason for psychedelics. I mean, that goes more to having a spiritual breakthrough or having another level of ego dissolution that's beyond the one that they can maybe maintain a steady state in.
And I mean, I'm I wouldn't say that simply a psychedelic experience is going to resolve your chronic inflammation. It could be part of the journey, but there are other factors, obviously, dietary and lifestyle factors.
Oh yeah.
Those things don't get resolved, then just a psychedelic.
But does it wake them up to that? I mean, that's one of the things, right? It's like psychedelics are an appetite suppressant. So like even just that, say someone's chronically overeating, or say they're eating poor nutrient dense foods. Like they might have a shift in that, and then that changes their behavior. And that's kind of how the point, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. It allows us to question our attachments, because you can kind of get to a state, hopefully, of just acceptance of yourself, acceptance of what is, and sort of see what's underlying a lot of those drives that we're not fully conscious of, which can be driven by biological processes, even microbiological processes in our gut, but often related to like early childhood trauma, etc. So absolutely, this psychedelic experience can be very helpful to reset our relationship with materiality. And that includes food, that includes lifestyle.
How powerful. I mean, really, especially for people like that can't shift out of their pattern. Like they're trying to shift out of their pattern. They want to shift out of their pattern, and they can't change at the level of habit. Or they're in a pattern where they don't seem to be able to change at the level of habit. And so then they can do a macro dose with a sitter potentially, and have a shift where they have pattern recognition, where they see what's causing what, or what's contributing, and what changes they can make in order to have a different outcome.
Yeah, and on a physical level, like one of the things that we can observe happens when people take psychedelics is that in the days and weeks afterwards, is a subtle change in brain structure. This whole concept of neuroplasticity comes into play, that you can actually shift the structure of the brain itself, create new neural pathways, change cognitive patterns, etc. And so they can be very helpful for that. Both the macro.
How much is that happening with like right and left side of the brain, like from tripping? Like because I know you've done a ton of research on this. Like, have you run into any that there's more communication happening on psychedelics with the left and right side of the brain? Like that there's just more. So if someone's more in a pattern, it can supersede the pattern.
Well, yeah, I mean, hemispheric lateralization is probably to some extent intrinsic. I mean, you can see differences between men and women generally. Women typically have a thicker corpus callosum, allowing for better communication between the hemispheres. Females generally have a better developed temporal region of the brain on the right side, which allows better integration between emotions and language, whereas men have typically have a smaller, less developed region of that part of the brain. So, I mean, I don't know if you observed, but men have a harder time generally talking about their emotions, and, will usually shift to more of a left-brained, kind of analytical, rational perspective of emotions. And, that's underlying a lot of the fundamental relationship problems, I think, between men and women generally. And I'm saying generally because it doesn't obviously apply to all individuals, but just as a general pattern. So taking psychedelics, what it does, it just kind of lights up all these different areas of the brain and interconnects them in ways that they're not normally interconnected. So that's why the psychedelic experience can be so discombobulating. And it's difficult to make sense of it. Like people will undergo a psychedelic experience, and even in the period afterwards, as they're thinking about their experience, have a hard time understanding or integrating actually what it all meant. And sometimes it's not actually all that important to figure out what it all meant. I mean, I think it's just an ongoing process of unfolding. But if you just light up all the areas of the brain so they're all talking to one another, it will be discombobulating, because that's not normally how the brain works. But it's the reintegration experience afterwards that is actually more helpful, and it allows them to make sense of the experience as they reintegrate. So it's not like the visions necessarily are always helpful to people or are meant to be taken literally. It's just kind of like the explosion experience that they have of having all these different parts of their brain lit up at the same time But as they kind of coalesce that experience and reintegrate, then they get all the benefits of the neuroplasticity and the neuroregeneration, the cognitive enhancement, the growth of new neurons that happens under the influence of that experience or post-experience.
Yeah, I mean, the research shows that for people, it tends to be one of their top 5 life experiences when they recall, like birth of children, right? Marriages, psychedelic trips. And that, to me, that's like, wow, like something deeply impacted the brain, like something really, I mean, if we look at Tarpaka Kapha, right? Like something shifted in a profound enough way for that to be a marker in time that like, oh, from that experience, that peak experience, there was a shift that changed me fundamentally for the better.
Oh, absolutely. I've seen some remarkable cases, even in my own family, like when my mother was dying of cancer, and finally towards the end of her life, she finally agreed to take a psychedelic trip, and it changed her as a person. So for the last period of her life, she literally was a different person. It was amazing to watch. And I think that's part of the death process too. I think death, the whole dying process, prepares us for that shift. But there's things that she would not have been able to shift without that assistance. So quite amazing to bear witness to.
I want to know the dosage on that, but I also want to mention that, I mean, if we look in yoga philosophy and we look at the kleshas and abhinavesha, this fear of death, and that if we look at the research on psychedelics and palliative care, like when people have a death sentence, that there's a documented research, there's documented evidence that that fear of death, which might be there for the person's entire life, really, in some subtler level, obviously more acutely with the palliative diagnosis, but that fundamentally changes. So even though the person's closer to death than they've ever been, the fear's not there.
Well, it's that ego dissolution experience. That's where the fear of death comes from. It's death of ego, right? Like all the things that we do, we struggle so hard to perpetuate this notion of ego. Even in our everyday lives, when we're far removed from the idea of death, we live in fear of that dissolution state, that we won't get what we need, we won't get what we want, that we'll be confronted with all these problems and cause suffering and sorrow. So if we're not attached to that ego state, if it's even temporarily dissolved and our consciousness flows into the boundless, then death becomes less of a fear, because we realize that life exists beyond the boundaries of our ego. And of course, that's not something that our conditioned experience tells us. For good reason. We tell kids not to run across the street in traffic and give people all these different rules about how to survive, wear seatbelts, get vaccinated, or whatever it is. And they all have good reasons behind them, but also they tend to solidify or harden the shell of the ego. And that has its own pitfalls. And this fear of dissolution is really what drives it. So I think we'd be a lot healthier society if we put more energy and attention into facilitating this state of ego dissolution at the right time and in the right place. One of the problems with psychedelics, and certainly maybe with my experience growing up, is just that I was exposed to them in an unhealthy environment. As a teenager at a party, it's not the place to be taking psychedelics, but it's where a lot of people get exposed to it.
Yeah, true. So I want to talk about ego in terms of this identity, personality, dissolution, just to make it more accessible to listeners. So like one of the things that I find with personality, and I love Dr. Benjamin Hardy's book, Personality Isn't Permanent, for like more of a Western behavioral science thing than a yogic thing on it. And it's this idea that like who we think we are and what we're attached to, and I also relate it to like who we think other people are. Like anything that really takes us out of a beingness state, a state of curiosity, a childlike wonderment. I like how Rumi said something about like, it was like sell your knowing and purchase bewilderment, something like that, like where it's, yeah, like you're buying in on bewilderment, and that enables you to become whoever you want to become next without the pattern so in place of who you think you are and what you think you like and what you think you don't like and who you think someone else is and what they should like and not like and what they should do or not do or what you should do and not do. And it just sort of takes an eraser to that and just opens up the white screen.
Yeah, and it re-engages the power of imagination to create and recreate the world. I mean, when you just take a moment and look all around you, everything around you is a function or product of imagination. You know, like the computers that we're talking on, the cars that we drive, the cities we live in, they're all a function of imagination. And it's from that imaginative state that eventually they're consolidated into a material reality. And then when we're confronted with that material reality, we can kind of get stuck within that structure. And so it's important to re-engage the imagination to understand how we can be constantly recreating our perception and our material relationship with the world. So kids have that in spades. You know, that's why, like, for example, I was talking to some colleagues about this recently, like when kids get warts up to about a certain age, and until they stop believing in Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy, I can take a magic rock or a magic feather and I can rub it on the wart, which is a virus, right? So disembodied, basically genetic information that's taking over the cellular machinery, make little copies of itself, very, very similar to the Ayurvedic concept of what a demon is. I rub my magic rock on there, and usually within a week or so, that wart will just disappear. It's just gone, right? Because it's the power of their imagination and consciousness overcame the consciousness of that virus to basically get it out of the body, or at least stop it from reproducing and infecting the body. But, you know, like an adult, after a certain age, the only way to get rid of that virus is to burn it off. You got to cut that sucker out. We need to see blood. We need to feel pain. We got to do something to convince our ego that somehow we've made progress in the matter. You know, and so it's very curious to me about that, you know, that when you're a child, there's this sort of notion that there's another reality beyond what we actually see. Like kids are naturally curious and inquisitive. And if you tell them that such and such is over there, they're just like, what? Really? Even if they can't see it, they're like, maybe that could be true. Why not? You know, we could say that from the perspective of yoga or Ayurveda, they're just much more connected to that kind of sattvic state where the subjective becomes much more powerful. You know, and then as we get older and we see the way the world works, we kind of our ego gets consolidated within the tamasic experience or perception. So that's what the psychedelics can be helpful for, to return us back to that childlike state of just pure imagination, where we see the veil of reality can get ripped away, and we can see that there are depths to the reality that we weren't even aware of. And then physically, that's about interconnecting all these different parts of the brain that normally don't talk to each other.
Yeah, and it just speaks to what you were saying earlier about ahamkara, that like I am self, right? I am, right? And so with that, it's like there's this entrance into the higher order of like the organism's organized at a higher order, and that's when that happens, then the child's consciousness is like, wait. This is like I had the little magic rock dusted off or magic feather dusted off, and it's like the cell's remembering that it's part of the whole, so then its natural immunity can fight the virus. And to me, that's like so much of what really happens. And I feel like it happens with any of these wild habits. It's an up level of the self knowing the self, and it just eats inflammation for breakfast. It just eats it. It just eats it. And to me, it's interesting too. I want to know more about, well, first of all, what was the dosage you gave your mom? Because my dad is dying of cancer and he's down to maybe high 160s. He normally weighed about 200.
As I said, I usually give like a standard dose of 5 grams of psilocybe cubensis. It's definitely on the higher side of dosage. Like usually people will get psychedelic effects like at around 1 to 2 grams. Yeah. But I usually suggest a 5-gram dosage so they get the full experience. And, yeah. There's no worry or concern that they might not get the full effects. I want them to have the full effects.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that makes sense. So even if they're dropping weight or whatever, what you're saying is like 5 is a guaranteed trip, and that's why it's a good standard.
It is for me. That's what I found in my experience. But I wouldn't say,
or not guaranteed, but it's like a more likely.
Yeah.
Nothing's guaranteed.
Yeah, not guaranteed. But most people, if they're open to the experience, if there isn't anything in the way of that experience, will have a profound experience with that dosage. We want to get them the sort of a pre-verbal state, right? Where like when you're asking them about their experience and they're just like, they can't even talk about it, because if they can, they're like, oh, well, I see stars and they're still in that ego state. It's like ego perceiving a boundary that lies outside of them. I want them to be immersed in that. And so everything falls away. And so, there's not usually a lot of conversation when someone's in that experience, or if I'm having a conversation with them, it's just little bits of words or random observations, but, it's symptomatic of their whole brain being lit up in a way that's discombobulating, which is part of the reset experience that's required.
Yeah. So let's talk about plant medicine and drugs and legality and whatnot. So it seems like plant medicines got labeled as drugs, and then the drug, at least in the United States, and like the Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA, was in charge of policing people using these plant medicines. And so with that, there's a lot, I would say, of people that are skeptical just because it was outlawed, right? Rather than being seen as a plant medicine. And I feel like what's happening now is a re-education to the modern human of like, wait, no, these are plant medicines. They're used specifically as medicines are specific, and it can be okay. How does it work for you in terms of just the legality?
Oh, well, it's not legal. So I'm practicing something that would probably be deemed to be illegal. But like as a herbalist, I use a variety of herbs that probably would also be considered to be illegal. I mean, I don't use it a lot, but I've used cannabis in my practice for 25 years. There are toxic dose, we call them toxic dose or low dose medicinal plants. For example, those that are in the Solanaceae like belladonna or datura or hyoscyamus, I use those. Aconite is a herb that we use that's pretty toxic and has to be processed correctly. In Ayurveda, I use some of the rasa aushadha medicines, which are purified minerals, medicines that have profound healing properties when used at the correct dosage and at the correct time. There's really no substitute for them. So, I use all kinds of medicines that are definitely not sanctioned by conventional medicine. There's very little understanding about how to use them. And so that's pretty much if we're also talking to about this with some colleagues of the day, if you are pregnant and you're looking about what herb can I use and you Google it, every single herb is going to say, oh, this herb is not recommended in pregnancy, right? But the thing is, it's really hard to give someone a herb and to cause an abortion. I know, because I've seen people try to do it.
I've tried. I have tried personally. Doesn't work.
Doesn't work.
I was like, wow, I'm going to die before my body lets go of this baby. That was my experience.
Exactly. Yeah. The baby's being served first in a hierarchical fashion. That's just the biology of it. So there's all this worry, concern, and hand-wringing around these herbs, but it just, especially nowadays in the internet, just these ideas just get repeated ad infinitum, but they're incorrect. The opinion comes from non-experts. It comes from people that have no practical experience in the usage of these plants. An expert nowadays is someone who can just crack open a book and, refer to some study that they don't even bother reading, but they don't have any practical experience with them. So that is the case too with these psychedelics. They've been outlawed or made illegal because there simply hasn't been an understanding about their proper usage. And there is a possibility for abuse, as there is for anything like sugar or coffee or pornography or whatever people expose themselves
to. Or pharmaceutical drugs. I mean, if we look at it that way, right, there's a direct correlation between the illegalization of plant medicine and the rise of pharmaceuticals. So if we don't throw that on the table, and if we don't look at, have you listened to that Michael Pollan interview where he talks about this article he was writing on poppies in 1995, 96 for Harper's Magazine? Mm-hmm. So Harper, he was writing for Harper's and New York Times. Harper's is like, hey, write an article on like how to make your own opium. So he's like, all right. So he starts growing the poppies and he's consulting with this guy who wrote the book on it, including all the recipes on it. And that guy gets his apartment seized. He gets thrown in jail. He has all these legal fees. And so Poland's like, Harper's, do we like, what are we going to do with this? Do we publish it? Well, when we look back on the situation, it's like that's when the Sacklers were pushing through their new patents with Purdue, right? To own the opioids. And it's like, you guys, that's how it works. Like, it's not hard to find the correlation.
No, absolutely. And things have changed a lot. I mean, here in Canada in the mid 90s, they wanted to ban over 100 different medicinal plants, you know, herbs, even like ginger and garlic. If they were in encapsulated form, they wanted to ban them, and yet you could buy them in the grocery store. It was just a, you know, a state of cognitive dissonance. It made no sense. Fortunately, we were able to stop that law from being passed. But yeah, you look at something like the popularity and the usage of common antidepressants, the SSRIs, and how ubiquitous they're used and how difficult they are to get off of. Does the pharmaceutical industry want you to know that you can make a microdose extract of psilocybin and transition someone from a full dose of an SSRI to the psilocybin extract in one day, and that they won't go through any withdrawal symptoms, and that just naturally taking that extract over a period of weeks, it creates these neuroplastic changes in their brain that about 3 weeks, 4 weeks later, they don't even need that remedy anymore because it's done its job. Like, the pharmaceutical industry does not want you to know that.
Let's just go through, what's the list of side effects from SSRIs?
Oh, they're huge. Loss of libido, just a feeling of being dead, chronic fatigue, depression, suicidal ideation. I mean, that's the crazy thing about SSRIs. And we've had it here in my little community where people have been really depressed. They go to Emerge and they put them on SSRIs and they end up killing themselves. It's so sad because
it happened to my friend's brother. My friend's an MD. We were having this exact conversation a month ago. We were on a long walk in Salt Lake. She's been an MD for, I don't know, 15 years. And it's like exactly when I asked her, because we were childhood friends, and I was like, what happened? Tell me, like, from your MD perspective, what happened to your brother? And exactly what you just said.
Oh,
Cascade of events.
That happened with many years ago. The reason why I developed this microdose extract is because my father, stepfather suffering from late stage Parkinson's, was really distraught with my mother's impending death and was already on high dose of medication to manage the Parkinson's. We went to see his neurologist, and the only thing that she had to offer him was an SSRI, which in the first 6 weeks of administration increases your risk of suicidal ideation. He was already trying to find her morphine to kill himself, right? It was just a shit show. And so I was like, there's no way we're going to give him this. It's already a big mess. So that's why I developed this liquid psilocybin-based extract. And
had you read research on it, or were you like, let's just test this out and see? Because you knew
just test it out. No, I mean, I've been using psilocybin mushrooms in a macrodose format. But I was aware of the underlying pharmacology, but this was like almost 10 years ago. So there really wasn't much that was known about microdosing. It was amazing is that I gave it to him, and he went from being morose and super depressed within 45 minutes. And he was like, well, let's go to the mall. Let's go do something. Let's go shopping. But, just something outside of himself.
Yeah, let's go do something.
And it was dramatic how in just 40 minutes later, he was in a completely altered state. And the lovely thing about the psilocybin extract is that if you don't feel you need it, you don't need to take it. So if it's a great day, it's a sunny day, you woke up feeling good.
Yeah.
You had your cup of coffee and you're like, yeah, all right, let's go. I'll fire it up. You don't need to take it. But that's not the case with an SSRI. You can't miss your dosage. Otherwise, you're going to get all these neurological effects. You're going to get the zaps. You're going to get really bizarre symptoms. So I use this liquid psilocybin extract to help wean people off of the SSRIs. And then eventually they stop taking my extract. So they're not dependent upon it. That's not what the pharmaceutical industry really wants. This is why they love the SSRIs, because they're impossible to get off of. But now, if this gets out there that the psilocybin extract can be used to wean people off of SSRIs, look for some pushback from them. They're going to start raising the red flag about all the dangers of psilocybin. Fortunately, I think that they've lost that argument. I think there's just so much research coming out. There's so much social acceptance that this.
Yeah, it's like Johns Hopkins and UCLA. It's like big stuff, bigger money's going. Not enough money, but bigger money's going.
There's a big paradigm that's shifting right now.
So let me say a few things on that. Like, one is, if we look at citizen data and user groups, we have tons of research over time. And I sense that a lot of people don't know about citizen data and looking at user groups, and to start to consider like but like if we look at Ayurveda, like huge amount of citizen data over a couple thousand years. And then same thing with user groups, like user groups around communities. But the same thing's true with, like, are you familiar with that the citizen data on LSD microdosing? Because they found that like people would just exactly what you're saying, like they'd forget to take it. Like they'd start taking it and their life would get better, and then they wouldn't need it and they just would forget to take it. And then a month or two would go by and they're like, oh wait, that is like the most non-addictive, right? Deeply transformational therapy.
Absolutely, it can be. Absolutely, it can be. I don't use the LSD so much, except in macrodose format. I don't microdose with it typically, but I see a lot of possibility for it. I tend to just gravitate to the natural products.
Yeah, sure.
So yeah, I have a lot of affinity for the psilocybin mushrooms in particular. So
with states like in the United States, like with Oregon legalizing home growth of psilocybins, what do you think in terms of like for people to get their hands on what they want, the plant medicines that they want? How do you advise people to do that can't get it through an herbalist, for example?
Yeah, well, psilocybin containing mushrooms aren't hard to grow. So there are spores that you can buy, and there are grow kits that you can buy, and empowered with the internet, you can certainly find all of those things. You can get the materials you need, the substrate that's needed to grow the mushrooms, and inoculate the substrate with the spores and grow your own mushrooms at home. You can buy entire kits that allow you to do that. I believe, I'm not sure about the States, but here in Canada, there's the spores themselves, because they don't contain any psilocybin, no active drug, they're not illegal, so you can obtain them. And once you grow them at home, then conceivably it is illegal. But I don't know about where you are, but where I am in Canada, we legalized cannabis a few years ago. And even here, like, you're seeing shops pop up where they're selling psilocybin extracts, and they're not being harassed or hassled by the police at all. So it's kind of in a gray market, like where cannabis was a few years ago. Same thing. There were shops popping up everywhere. No one was getting arrested. No one was getting busted. And I think it's just not a policing priority here in Canada anyway. So I imagine that'll also be happening, certainly in the more progressive states like Oregon or California and the East Coast. But it depends where you are in the States. If they're talking about like Alabama, I imagine it's a different scenario there.
Yeah. It is great to see overall the trend is going to decriminalization of plant medicines. So hooray.
Yeah.
For that.
Yeah. And, plant medicines, to me, shouldn't be a euphemism for just the psychedelic ones. Plant medicines are just what the earth provides us for our own healing and nourishment. Even plant medicines can be food, there's many, herbs that are across the boundary between food and medicine. So yeah, for me as a herbalist, I just include them in my scope of practice, whether they're psychedelic or non-psychedelic, whether they're low dose toxic or whether they're high dose and safe. They're all plant medicines to me. Yeah.
Well, it goes back to that. What is it? That parable of the Ayurveda graduation parable from however many centuries ago about the professor sends the students out into the field to find a plant that's not a medicine.
Jivaka Kamarabacha. Exactly. From the Pali Canon, go off and find me a plant that cannot be used as a medicine. And he turns up empty handed because he couldn't find one. But then he's uplifted and celebrated by his teacher saying, you understand the teaching. Because there really is nothing that can't be used as a medicine in the correct context. Even drugs, I'm not like anti-drug, anti-pharmaceutical in that regard. They have a role to play. But I think, if we start incorporating more of these plant medicines, we'll see that the pharmaceuticals, the role really should be greatly diminished. They're really, in many cases, just last resort remedies. And we have so many other better alternatives that don't create this disequilibrium in the body, and allow, just like these microdose extracts, just allow the person to heal naturally and not become dependent upon them.
So do you find with the entheogens, these plants that are opening to higher levels of consciousness through ego dissolution, there's a lot of different ones. You've mentioned a lot of them, that like having for someone that's on we'll just say like the path of living their life awake and out of the pattern self, that having regular usage, like, which might just be now and again, it's a very natural impulse. And part of the reason I ask is in the research I've done, it seems like it goes back to pre-human, the use of the entheogens. It goes back to us being hominids. So like 2 million years ago, we find research of hominids and psychedelics. Mm-hmm. And then there's theories and research on theories, including some of the work of Thomas McKenna, 25, 30 years ago, that ties our cognitive function to our use of psychedelics. And just what you were saying in terms of like how it awakens the brain, how all of a sudden it turns on parts of the brain that just were not turned on. And that also religious experiences, right? These breakthroughs to higher orders of perception are directly correlated with the use of entheogens over time. So a lot of like even the archetypal hero story type journey that has a dramatic shift in perception, dramatic shift in identity from the beginning of the story to the end of the story, and that these archetypal stories are our mythology, which then become our religious stories, that these also are tied to humans using entheogens and having this ego dissolution breakthrough to higher order perception and having it be a life-changing experience.
Well, absolutely. The various different natural substances that modulate the serotonin and dopamine systems of the brain probably were crucial in the development of human culture and human civilization. And there certainly is good archaeological evidence of that goes back thousands of years, where you can see abrupt shifts in terms of technology and art that were commensurate with the usage of psychedelic substances. You can see cave paintings of shamans covered in mushrooms, that clearly are representative of evoking the psychedelic state. Those are commensurate with some pretty cool changes that happened in that culture that were dramatically different from earlier cultures. So I think that the entheogenic plants definitely had an impact on the development of the human brain and in turn human culture. I think there's a lot of facets to human culture, to religion, that probably owe their origin to these psychedelic substances. And it's unfortunate that that many of these ideas and philosophies have become so hardened and consolidated and fragile, if you will, that they don't allow for a reassessment of their origins. So like in Catholicism or in other religions, there's no discussion of like how these entheogenic substances might be helpful for someone to get closer to God or to bring Jesus into their heart. If that's their objective, it seems to make sense that some of these entheogenic substances might be conducive to facilitate that state. And, we don't get caught up in all the dogma, because unfortunately the dogma comes later.
Yeah, totally. Amen. Okay, I could talk to you forever, and I know you're a busy man. So I just want to say, come to the Tetons and hang out with me sometime. Awesome. Or Punta Mita. Yeah, either one. You can ski or surf. Choose your location. So everyone, this has been Todd Caldecott, who's the executive director of Dogwood School of Botanical Medicine and author of books on Ayurveda, Buddhist medicine, and Ayurveda in Nepal. And I'm excited about the research that you're doing on Ayurveda and psychedelics. I promise to pump it out to my community because I believe it is a core wild habit.
Awesome. Thanks, Kate.